This narrated set of notes serves as an introduction to the highlights for Week 7 topics that focus on creating an Excel application with validation and comments, as well as protecting the workbook contents. Week 7 Part 2 will cover Session 7.3 on macros and security. Here are the major themes for Module 7, Sessions 1 and 2. Many are likely familiar to you from working with database tools and Access. Excel provides a limited set of some of these capabilities for data entry type forms and report-like outputs. In our module, we will be using a data entry form for registration and a receipt as an output-like form. Developing an Excel application and protecting workbook data. Session 7.1 creates an application, and you will practice using defined names in formulas for cells and cell ranges. Session 7.2, you will be practicing with validation rules, protecting the contents of worksheets and workbooks and cells, and adding, editing, and deleting comments. Session 3 is covered in the next presentation and will focus on Excel security features and creating and running macros. Here is a picture of the visual overview that you should review carefully. An Excel application is a spreadsheet written or tailored to meet specific needs. It typically includes reports and charts, a data entry area, and a custom interface, as well as instructions and clear documentation for using the application. Planning includes designing how the worksheets will be organized. You can enter and edit data, store data after it has been entered, use formulas to manipulate and perform calculations on data, display outputs such as reports, and in our example, a receipt. Naming cells and ranges. Cells and range references do not really indicate what data is stored in those cells. We just label them with letters and numbers like a bingo game. However, Excel allows you to define names for cells and/or ranges of cells. This provides meaning and description to the data we're interested in. A defined name enables you to quickly navigate within a workbook to the cell or range of cells with that defined name. You can use defined names to create more descriptive formulas as well. The rules for naming cells match the rules for naming tables. Remember those rules? First, the name must begin with a letter or an underscore. It can include letters and numbers as well as periods and underscores, but no other symbols and no spaces are allowed. It is easy to use the name box to create defined names. Here we see a defined name of activity fee for cell E11. After selecting the cell or range of cells, use the name box to quickly define the name. When you want to select cells and ranges by their defined name, find the name in the drop-down list by using the arrow. The name box will display all of the defined names in a workbook. Then you can select the cell or range referenced by that name. Use the Name Manager dialog box to create a new name, edit or delete existing names, and filter the list of names. Here is Session 2 overview for data validation and worksheet protection. To ensure that correct data is entered and stored in a worksheet, you should use data validation. Each validation rule defines criteria for the data that can be entered and stored in a cell. You can add input and error alert messages for the user to that cell or range of cells as well. You specify the validation criteria, the input message, and the error alert for the active cell in the data validation dialog box. One way to reduce the chance of data entry error is to display an input message when a user makes the cell active. Input messages appear as screen tips next to the cell when the cell is selected. Here is an example of the input message for the shirt size that gets displayed after the user selects the cell. Validating data entry. Each validation rule defines criteria for the data that can be entered and stored in that particular cell or range. Figure 7.15 describes the acceptable input values based on cell type. The first one, any value, refers to general format cells, where we can enter any number, text, or date. Whole numbers must be integers. You should review these when you're making your validation rules. After you put your validation rules into your cells or range of cells, it is important to test the data validation rules. You test validation rules by entering correct values to validate and then incorrect values that actually violate the validation rules. We want to verify that invalid data will not be permitted, that your validation rule will work as expected. List validation reduces the chance of user input errors by having them select from a list of acceptable values. Another way to minimize data entry errors is to limit access to certain parts of the workbook. Here is where protecting a worksheet and a workbook become valuable. Worksheet protection prevents users from changing cell contents, such as editing formulas in a worksheet. Workbook protection also prevents users from changing the workbook's organization, such as inserting or deleting worksheets in the workbook. You can also keep users from viewing the formulas used in a workbook. Another method of protecting worksheet data is to lock cells. Every cell in a workbook has a locked property that determines whether changes can be made to that cell. The locked property has no impact as long as the worksheet is unprotected. After you protect a worksheet, the locked property controls whether the cell can be edited. Unlock a cell by turning off the locked property. Here is a picture of the locked property for a particular cell. Right now it has been turned off. By default, the locked property is turned on for every cell, and worksheet protection is turned off. Unless you unlock cells in a worksheet before protecting the worksheet, all of the cells in the worksheet will be locked, and you won't be able to make any changes. Usually, you will protect the worksheet but leave some cells unlocked. To do so, first, turn off the locked property of cells in which data can be entered. Then, protect the worksheet to activate the locked property for the remaining cells. Protecting a worksheet. When you set up worksheet protection, you specify which actions are still available to users in the protected worksheet. You can limit users to selecting only unlocked cells, or allow the user to select any cell in the worksheet. These choices remain active as long as the worksheet is protected. A protected worksheet can always be unprotected. So if you need to, you can add a password that must be entered to turn off the protection. Worksheet protection applies only to the contents of a worksheet, not the worksheet itself. This is contained in the workbook. To keep a worksheet from being modified, you need to protect the workbook. You can protect both the structure and the windows of a workbook. Protecting the structure prevents users from renaming, deleting, hiding, or inserting worksheets. Unprotecting a worksheet in a workbook. You can turn off Worksheet Protection at any time. You must unprotect a worksheet to edit its contents. You can unprotect the workbook. If you need to insert a new worksheet or rename an existing worksheet, you will need to unprotect the protected workbook, make the changes to the structure, and then reapply the workbook protection. Comments are often used in workbooks to explain the contents of a particular cell, such as a complex formula, or to provide instructions to the user. They are also useful for sharing ideas and notes from several users who are collaborating on a project. When you collaborate on a workbook, the top of the comment boxes will show the name of each user who created that comment. A small red triangle appears in the upper right corner of a cell with a comment. The comment box appears when you point to a cell with a comment. Here is an example. This is the end of the introduction to Module 7, Sessions 1 and 2. If you have any questions, thoughts, concerns, or comments, please post them to the Week 7 class forum.